there, come a little closer to the fire with me. Tonight, I want to tell you a story that begins with an emperor who has everything and still cannot sleep. A man surrounded by banners and spears, yet listening for the smallest sound inside his own chest. We are going to sit with him on a frozen frontier, where the Danube River breathes like a dark animal in the night. We will hear the soft scratch of a pen, while whole nations press their weight against the border. We will drift through a city of marble and shadow, where crowds cheer for blood they do not have to spill themselves. And later, much later, we will feel the quiet dread of a father, realizing the world he protects may soon be handed to hands that do not understand restraint. If you like these long, slow stories that turn history into a kind of candlelit hush, please tap like and subscribe. It helps this little corner of the night keep going, and it lets you find your way back here whenever you need the room to feel softer. Now let your shoulders drop. Let the muscles of your face loosen, as if warm air is passing over your cheeks. Unclench your jaw. Let your tongue rest. Take a breath in that is not forced, and let it out like a small surrender. Good. There is a certain kind of quiet that only comes when you accept you are safe. Right now, the world can keep spinning on the other side of the walls. Tonight, we will listen to it from far away, like rain in a different street. Picture this: a military tent on a winter night. The canvas is thick, but the wind still finds the seams. It makes the tent whisper, a slow creak and sigh, as if the fabric remembers every storm it has ever held back. Outside, boots pass now and then. A guard pauses, shifts his weight, the metal of his gear faintly clicking. Somewhere farther out, a horse stamps once, then settles. The camp never truly sleeps. It only changes its rhythm. Inside the tent, there is candlelight. Not the bright, confident light of a palace chandelier. This is a smaller light, stubborn, trembling at the edge. It throws warm color onto the emperor's hands and leaves the corners of the tent in a patient darkness. The flame bends when the wind pushes, then straightens again. It smells a little of smoke and fat and wick. It leaves a thin soot on the air. At a rough table, the most powerful man on earth sits alone. He is not writing a command, not an order to march, not a decree to punish, not a list of taxes or names. He is writing to himself. A private journal, pages meant for no one. The kind of writing that is almost like speaking, but safer. The kind you do when you need the truth to stay still long enough to look at it. His name is Marcus Aurelius. Philosopher, emperor. A man with the authority to move legions, to turn the empire like a huge wheel, to lift cities and break them. And yet, in these quiet hours, he is only trying to do something smaller and harder. He is trying to be a good human being. Honestly, I have always found it strange that the higher you rise, the more you can feel your own smallness. Power looks like a wide sky from the outside. From the inside, it can feel like a ceiling pressing down. The more people depend on you, the less room there is to be careless. The more eyes watch you, the lonelier your thoughts become. Marcus knows this loneliness. He is on the frontier, far from Rome, far from the marble halls that echo with politics and perfume. Out here, the air bites your skin. It dries your lips. It turns breath into fog. The ground is hard, and when it is not hard, it is mud, thick and black, clinging to sandals and boots, pulling at every step as if it wants to keep you. Beyond the river, other camps flicker. Not Roman camps. Fires of people the Romans call barbarians, Germanic tribes, confederations, nations of families pressed together by hunger, cold, and the slow pressure of history. They gather because they need land, because the climate shifts, because the border is a line of wealth and grain and warm houses, and lines like that invite hands. Marcus can hear them, sometimes, if the wind is right. Not words, just the sense of motion. A distant shout that could be a joke or a threat. A drum that beats for reasons no Roman clerk will ever write down. When you have lived long enough with danger, you begin to feel it without seeing it. Like the way you can feel thunder in your bones before the lightning arrives. And still, Marcus writes. He writes about death. He writes about duty. He writes about how quickly a life becomes dust, and how a name that once filled stadiums becomes a faint mark on stone. He writes about how the body is a temporary house, and how it is foolish to decorate the walls while the foundation crumbles. He writes reminders to himself. Simple lines, stern lines, gentle lines, like knots tied in a rope so you do not lose your way in fog. Sometimes, the candlelight catches the wet shine of his ink. The pen scratches, pose, scratches again. His hand stops as if he is listening to the silence between sentences. Outside, someone coughs. Somewhere, a piece of wood pops in a fire. Marcus breathes, steady and quiet, because he has learned that panic is a luxury. This is not the story people expect when they think of an emperor. They imagine triumph. They imagine gold and laurel and the roar of crowds. They imagine arrogance, the intoxication of being obeyed. They imagine a man who believes he is made of different material than ordinary people. Marcus did not feel like that, not in the pages he wrote when no one was watching. The more authority he gained, the more he questioned its value. The higher he rose, the more he tried to bow his head. He commanded an empire that stretched from Britain to the deserts. He ruled tens of millions of lives with a word. Yet he kept returning to the same quiet questions, as if he could not let them go. What is a good life? What is worth wanting? How do you stay clean inside when the world around you is built on pain? Because Rome, for all its order and splendor, was also a machine that ran on suffering. Even Marcus, raised in silk, knew that. He could not know it. The empire was everywhere, in the stones of roads, in the arches of aqueducts, in the grain ships sliding into harbors. And it was also everywhere in the chains, in the tenements, in the arena sand that swallowed men's names. In the tent, the emperor shifts. The chair creaks. He lifts his eyes from the page. For a moment, he does not look like a statue. He looks like a tired man, a man whose body aches, a man who has been awake too long. And maybe that is the first dark truth of this story. Power does not protect you from being human. It only gives you more chances to fail loudly. Marcus had doubts. He had fears. He wrote as if he were trying to talk himself back from a ledge, not a physical ledge, but the edge of despair, the edge of bitterness, the edge of the thought that none of this matters. Somewhere in the camp, a messenger moves past, his footsteps quick, then slower, then gone. In vain, every footstep can carry news. Every sealed letter can shrink your world down to one sentence. A son is dead. A city is sick. A border has broken. Marcus knows what it is to open a message and feel his throat go cold. He knows what it is to keep his face calm in front of others, then return to his tent and sit in the quiet until his hands stop shaking. He knows what it is to lead when your own heart feels fragile. If you were standing here with me, beside this imagined fire, I would tell you to watch the way he writes. Not fast, not dramatic. He is not trying to impress anyone. The lines are plain. The words are simple. It is like listening to a person whisper instructions to themselves in the dark. Do not be swept away by anger. Do not crave praise. Do not cling to what must be lost. Do what is right. Quietly. Again. Again. There is something eerie about it. In the softest way, the emperor is not writing to conquer. He is writing to endure, to keep his own soul from hardening into something ugly, to remember that every human being, even an enemy beyond the river, is a piece of the same strange world. And yet, the world does not care how wise you are. The world brings plague. The world brings war. The world brings betrayal. Sometimes, not always with a dagger. Sometimes with a smile. Sometimes with a son who grows into a man you cannot recognize. We are not there yet. We will get there, slowly. Like walking down a long corridor, with lamps set far apart. Each pool of light revealing one more painting on the wall. For now, stay with the tent. Stay with the candle. Stay with the small circle of warmth and ink. Marcus dips the pen again. The ink makes a tiny, dark pool before it turns into a line. Outside, the river keeps breathing. The Danube is not dramatic. It is patient. It carries silt and cold water and the memory of mountains. It does not care who is emperor. It does not care who is afraid. And that is why it is such a good companion to his thoughts. He writes about time as if it were water, always moving, always taking something away, always leaving something behind. He writes about fame as if it were smoke, visible, then gone. He writes about the body as if it were clay, shaped, then returned to earth. Dust, clay, water, candlelight. These are the honest things, the things that do not flatter you, the things that do not lie. In the far distance, beyond the line of the camp, something howls. It could be a wolf. It could be a man. It could be the wind finding a hollow. The sound arrives thin, then fades. Marcus does not reach for a weapon. He does not call for a guard. He only pauses, and then he keeps writing. Because the real battle, for him, is not outside. It is inside. It is the battle against fear that makes you cruel, against exhaustion that makes you careless, against pride that makes you blind, against despair that makes you stop trying. The candle lowers. The flame is smaller now. It leans, straightens, leans again. Marcus sets down the pen and rubs his fingers together, as if he can feel the ink drying. He looks at the page one more time, then closes the journal. A simple act, a cover closing, a quiet finality. He sits there for a moment longer, letting the night settle, letting the air in the tent cool, and then warm again as the candle breathes. And as you listen, you can let your own thoughts soften. 2. You do not need to solve anything tonight. You do not need to win. You do not need to be perfect. Just breathe and let the story carry you. Because now we are going to drift backward, away from this winter frontier, away from the river and the tents, and into the bright, complicated city that raised him, into Rome, a city of marble dust and crowded air, of incense and sweat, of laughter and screams swallowed by stone, a city where a small boy will learn, far too early, that even the safest home can lose someone. And that lesson, that first shrinking number, will stay with him, quietly, for the rest of his life. Before we leave the frontier, let me slow the moment a little more. Imagine Marcus lifting the journal and feeling its weight. Not heavy, like armor, but heavy like responsibility. The leather cover is cool under his fingers, worn at the corners from being opened and closed so many nights. He slides it into a small wooden box, the kind that could hold letters, seals, a tiny piece of home. The lid settles with a soft sound. Outside, the river keeps moving under its thin crust of ice. You can hear it if you listen. Not a roar. A low, muffled, shifting, like something large turning in its sleep. The wind carries the smell of wet reeds and distant smoke, and the faint scent of horses and leather and iron. Marcus stands. His joints complain. He crosses the tent with careful steps, hailed then too, so the mud does not grab him. He opens the flap just enough to look out. A line of watch fires, sparks rising and vanishing. A soldier hunched against the cold, his breath a pale ribbon. Farther away, the dark ribbon of the Danube, and beyond it, the deeper dark of the unknown. The border is not a wall. It is a feeling. Marcus lets the flap fall closed again. He returns to the candle and pinches the flame out. Smoke curls up, thin and gray, twisting like a thought you almost remember. The tent becomes darker, but not empty. This is the man we will follow. Not a legend carved in stone, but a breathing body in cold air, trying to keep his mind gentle in a world that keeps asking for hardness. Now, let us travel back to the first rooms, where he learned what gentleness cost. We will step into Rome the way you step into a warm bakery after cold streets. The air suddenly thick with voices and bread and incense. We will hear sandals on stone. We will see sunlight on marble. And we will notice, tucked behind the brightness, the quiet places where grief waits. Rome begins as a sound. Before it is a map, before it is an empire, it is noise that never quite stops. Carts over stone, vendors calling out prices, water splashing in public fountains, the distant cheer of a crowd that has found something to adore or to condemn. Even at night, when the city lowers its voice, there are still footsteps in alleys and the soft cough of someone trying to sleep in a room that holds too many bodies. If you were standing here with me, you would feel the air first. Warm, even in spring. Warmed by thousands of cooking fires and crowded rooms. It smells of olive oil and sweat, of bread and smoke, of incense drifting from temples, of damp wool drying on balconies. It also smells, sometimes, of sewage and sickness, because Rome is not gentle to the poor. It is a beautiful beast, and it has teeth. Into this city, in the year we call 121, a boy is born. Marcus Aurelius Antoninus will be his future name, but at first he is simply Marcus Annius Verus, a child of the highest families, a small bundle of breath wrapped in cloth. His father holds a respectable office. His mother comes from wealth so old it feels like part of the stone itself. Their world is privilege. Marble floors, courtyards with shaded pools, tutors who arrive with scrolls and patient voices, servants who move quietly, trying to be invisible. And still, even in privilege, the city leaks in. Rome does not stay on the street. It rises through the walls. It is there in the distant roar from the Colosseum when the crowd surges like a tide. It is there in the dust that drifts in from construction sites where new arches are lifted into place. It is there in the way your sandals pick up grit even after the servants sweep. Dust is honest. It finds everyone. As Marcus grows, he learns the shapes of Rome by small, slow experiences. A hand in his, guiding him across a courtyard. The cool touch of stone under bare feet. The smell of candle smoke in a shrine. The heavy folds of a cloak placed over his shoulders when the air turns sharp at dawn. He learns the city by listening. The Forum, with its speeches and arguments, its merchants and lawsuits, the sound of Greek philosophers debating under porticos, their voices rising and falling like waves, the clink of coins, the laughter of boys running between columns, chasing each other until a stern adult voice calls them back. He also learns the city by noticing what adults pretend not to see. The tenements, stacked high, crowded and fragile, where families live one above another like birds in a cage. Rooms where a single candle must do all the work of light, and where smoke leaves the ceiling dark. The way a collapse can happen overnight, and by morning the street is full of broken wood and people staring as if the world has betrayed them personally. Rome is a miracle of organization. roads that stitch the world together, aqueducts carrying water across distances that feel impossible, law that can turn chaos into order with a signature. Marcus will grow up surrounded by these achievements, and they will make him believe, at least for a while, that reason can tame anything. But Rome is also casual cruelty. Gladiators who fight so the crowd can forget its own hunger. Slaves bought and sold like tools. Public punishments offered as entertainment. A civilization that can build a temple in the morning and cheer for a death in the afternoon. Marcus is a child, so he does not put words to all of this. He only absorbs it, like water soaking into cloth. And then, when he is 3, the first quiet catastrophe arrives. His father dies. There is no dramatic scene that survives, no heroic last speech, just the sudden absence of a familiar voice, a familiar step in the hallway, the way a room can feel larger and colder when one person is gone. A child does not understand politics or mortality. A child understands that someone who was there is now not there, and that adults speak softly and avoid his eyes. The house changes. The servants move differently, careful. The women of the household light candles and whisper prayers. The air smells more strongly of incense. Marcus is lifted and held and told gentle lies that are meant to protect him, but the truth seeps through anyway. Grief has its own gravity. It pulls. You know that feeling when you lose something small. A key, a coin, and your mind keeps reaching for it out of habit. Now imagine that habit is reaching for a person, a father. A child keeps expecting the door to open, keeps expecting the laugh, keeps expecting the warmth. Each time it does not happen, something in the child learns a new shape of the world. Marcus will spend his life writing about death as a natural process. That idea did not begin as philosophy. It began as a missing presence in a childhood home. After the loss, Marcus is raised by his grandfather, a man of reputation and discipline. The older Marcus is known for integrity, for learning, for the calm authority that does not need to shout. He becomes the first great teacher in the boy's life, not by lectures, but by atmosphere. The grandfather rises early. He speaks carefully. He does not waste words. When he promises something, it happens. When he must refuse something, he refuses it without cruelty. He treats servants like people rather than furniture. He shows Marcus, by daily habit, that privilege is a kind of test, not a reward. This is where duty begins. Not in a battlefield, not in a Senate chamber, in a household routine, in the way an elder ties his sandals, in the way he offers a seat to someone who is tired. Marcus is given the finest education Rome can purchase. Teachers arrive with ink stains on their fingers, with scrolls rolled and unrolled until the papyrus softens. Marcus learns grammar, rhetoric, the art of speaking so that a room listens. He learns Greek, because every educated Roman must, and because Greek is the language of philosophy, medicine, and the deep old questions. He learns mathematics and music. He learns to exercise, or keep his body strong, because a Roman aristocrat must be ready to serve. He learns how to hold himself, how to stand in a room of older men without shrinking. But the most important thing he meets is a kind of hunger. Not hunger for food. Hunger for meaning. It is hard to explain, but some children have it early. They look at the world and they do not only want toys or applause. They want to know why things happen. They want to know what is fair. They want to know why grown men lie with confident faces. They want to know what a good person is, and whether such a thing is possible in a city that calls itself civilized while enjoying cruelty. Marcus is introduced to philosophy, and it catches him like a slow current. Not all at once, not with fireworks, more like a door opening and letting in cooler air. He encounters different schools of thought, each offering a different way to live. He hears of Plato and Aristotle, of paths that lead upward toward ideals or outward towards systems. And then he meets Stoicism. Stoicism does not promise comfort. It promises clarity. It says there are things you can control and things you cannot. It says your job is not to control the universe, but to control your own response. It says virtue is the only real treasure, and that everything else, wealth, status, praise, can vanish like smoke. For a boy born into unimaginable privilege, this is both frightening and liberating. It is frightening because it means his birth is not a guarantee of worth. He cannot hide behind his family name. He cannot pretend the gods love him more than they love the poor man in a tenement. Stoicism strips away the soft cushion under the ego. It is liberating because it offers him a way to stand in a world of contradiction without being torn apart by it. If you cannot control the cruelty of the arena, you can at least refuse to become cruel inside. If you cannot prevent death, you can at least meet it without flinching. If the crowd is foolish, you can still be wise. Somewhere in these years, Marcus begins to practice a kind of inner stillness. He sits with a candle and watches its flame. He listens to his own breath. He learns, slowly, that a mind can be trained like a muscle. That attention is a tool. That you can return to what is real, again and again, even when the world is loud. And then the empire, watching from above, notices him. In Rome, talent does not stay private for long, especially among the elite. The Emperor Hadrian hears about the boy with the serious eyes, the boy who speaks with care, the boy who seems oddly immune to the usual temptations of wealth. Hadrian is not an ordinary ruler. He is a builder, a traveler, a mind that cannot sit still. He loves Greece. He loves architecture. He loves the idea that the empire can be held together not only by force, but by culture and law. He is also a man without a natural heir. And so the future of the empire becomes a quiet anxiety that never fully leaves his side. Succession in Rome is not a family matter. It is a matter of survival. The wrong heir can turn peace into civil war. The wrong heir can turn order into blood. Hadrian devises a plan that is almost elegant in its coldness. He adopts Antoninus Pius, a respected man in his 50s, steady and competent, and Antoninus, in turn, is required to adopt two younger men, Marcus and Lucius Verus. A chain of adoption, like linking hands across a dangerous river, trying to make sure the empire does not fall into chaos when one body stops breathing. Marcus is still very young when this happens, barely more than a teenager, and yet his childhood ends anyway. Overnight, he is no longer just a bright boy in a wealthy house. He is a future emperor. Imagine the weight of that. Not a crown placed on your head yet, but a shadow that follows you everywhere. Every mistake matters more. Every word is watched. Every friendship is evaluated. Even your marriage is no longer your own. Marcus had been engaged to someone else, a normal arrangement among the elite. Hadrian's plan requires that engagement to be broken. Marcus must marry Faustina the Younger, the daughter of Antoninus Pius, to bind the new political family together. It is not romance. It is structure. Marcus accepts. He is not happy about the loss of choice, but he does what he has been trained to do. He places duty over desire. He practices acceptance the way some people practice music, repeating the same scales until the fingers learn them without thinking. From this point on, his education becomes more intense, more deliberate. He studies not only ideas, but governance. Not only how to speak, but how to judge. He begins to understand that power is less like a sword and more like a constant stream of decisions. Decisions that never stop. Decisions that touch lives you will never see. Some nights, when the city finally quiets, Marcus will sit alone with a lamp and write small notes to himself. Not yet the famous meditations, but the beginnings of that habit. Reminders, warnings, gentle scoldings. Do not be seduced by praise. Do not chase pleasure. Do not forget that people are fragile. Treat power like a borrowed tool. He does not know yet what the frontier will demand of him. He does not know that plague will sweep through the empire like a dark tide. He does not know how many letters he will receive that begin with loss. He does not know how cold a battlefield can feel at dawn, or how lonely leadership can become when the world expects you to be made of stone. For now, he is still in Rome, still learning, still watching. The city glows with torches at night. The streets hold shadows. Water in the fountains reflects candlelight in small, trembling pieces. Dust settles on statues. Time moves forward, steady, indifferent. And in the heart of it all, a young man prepares to step into the long apprenticeship that will shape him. Soon, Antoninus Pius will become his model of quiet rule, and Marcus will spend years beside him, learning how to hold an empire without letting it poison the hands that hold it. We will go there next. Slowly, one careful step at a time. I like to imagine one of those evenings in the grandfather's house. A courtyard quiet after dinner. The stone still holding warmth from the day. A basin of water catching the moon and breaking it into ripples when a breeze passes. Marcus sits with a scroll on his knees. He does not read quickly. He traces a line with one finger, pose, breathes, then reads again, as if each sentence is a stone he must lift and feel. A tutor waits. Somewhere, a servant sweeps. Slow strokes, whisking dust into a corner. In the distance, Rome mutters in its sleep. Soon those quiet evenings will be replaced by meetings and obligations. The gentle discipline of philosophy will be tested against the stubborn mess of real life. But the habit of returning to the page, returning to the breath, returning to what is within his control, that habit will travel with him. It will follow him into the palace, and later into the camps beside the river. Under Antoninus Pius, the world did not change with thunder. It changed the way a lamp changes a room, slowly, almost politely, until you look up and realize the shadows have moved and you are standing in a different place. Antoninus was not a man of dramatic speeches. He did not need a stage. He ruled the way a careful gardener tends an orchard, pruning here, watering there, never shouting at the trees to grow. In Rome, that kind of steadiness could feel like a miracle. After emperors who had been loud, suspicious, hungry for applause, Antoninus offered something quieter, something that did not glitter, but held. Marcus, still young, watched him the way a traveler watches a shoreline when the sea is rough. Not with romantic awe, but with attention that is almost desperate. He knew his own future depended on learning how to stand in power without losing himself in it. So he learned in the smallest ways. He learned by walking behind Antoninus through long corridors where footsteps echoed on marble and then softened on woven rugs. He learned by standing in Senate meetings where senators spoke with careful faces and where every compliment carried a hidden request. He learned by watching Antoninus listen more than he spoke, and by noticing how silence can be a tool, not an absence. When you are young, you think leadership is a single moment, a battle, a speech, a crown. Marcus began to understand that leadership is 1,000 quiet moments in a row. A petition from a widow, a dispute between merchants, a governor accused of cruelty, a city asking for relief after a fire, a soldier's family requesting payment that has been delayed. One decision after another, each one like a pebble dropped into water, sending ripples that travel farther than the hand that released it. Sometimes, late in the day, Marcus would step out into a courtyard just to breathe. Rome could be heavy, not only with heat and smoke, but with expectation. He would stand near a fountain and listen to water falling, steady, patient, repeating the same small sound until his mind began to match it. The water did not hurry. It did not panic. It simply did what it did. Marcus found comfort in that. Inside the imperial household, his training continued, as if the empire itself were a school. Antoninus made sure the young heir did not stop studying philosophy. If anything, the lessons became sharper, because now Marcus had to learn how to carry wisdom into rooms where wisdom was unwelcome. One of his most important teachers was Junius Rusticus, a Stoic with a plain manner and a strict presence. Rusticus did not flatter. He did not soften truths to make them easier to swallow. He offered Marcus books and a kind of discipline that felt like cold water. Rusticus introduced him to Epictetus, once a slave, later philosopher, a man who spoke of freedom as something that lived inside the mind, not in the title a person carried. Epictetus used a simple image that stayed with Marcus like a pebble in the shoe. We are actors in a play. We do not choose the role. We choose how well we perform it. For Marcus, that metaphor was almost painful, because it named what he already knew. He had not chosen the role of future emperor. It had been placed on him like a garment. At times it fit. At times it chafed. Yet the Stoic teaching suggested a path that did not depend on wishing for a different life. Love your fate, not as a romantic slogan, but as a practical method. If you fight reality, you spend your strength on what cannot be moved. If you accept it, you can use your strength to act well within it. Marcus tried to practice that acceptance, and he failed, and he practiced again. He had other teachers too. Alexander of Kotium trained him in rhetoric, in the art of speaking to a crowd and still sounding like you are speaking to one person. Marcus did not love rhetoric the way some men did. He distrusted words that existed only to win. But he understood that an emperor who could not speak clearly would be an emperor who could not guide. And then there was Fronto. If Rusticus was cold water, Fronto was warm fire, a master of Latin prose, a man who cared about the shape of a sentence the way a sculptor cares about the curve of stone. Fronto became more than a teacher. He became a friend. Their letters, later preserved, show something tender and slightly raw. Marcus confessed doubts. He admitted exhaustion. He worried about his health, about his temperament, about whether he was worthy of the role being built around him. Sometimes he sounded like a young man trying to breathe under a heavy cloak. Fronto would answer with encouragement, but also with a firmness that did not let Marcus hide. Do the work. Return to the work. That was the comfort. Not the promise that things would be easy, but the promise that steady effort could hold a life together. During these years, Marcus began to write for himself more regularly. Not polished essays, not texts meant for other eyes, just private lines, a little like prayers, though he would not have used that word. Notes to guard his mind. He would write at dawn when the household was quiet, when the only sound was a servant sweeping dust from the hallway. Slow strokes, gathering it as if the dust were a small enemy that always returned. Marcus would write by candlelight, the flame making a soft pool of gold on the page, the rest of the room a gentle dark. He wrote about the soul, and about how easily it can be stained by impatience. He wrote about reputation, and how it can disappear like smoke, leaving only the memory of chasing it. He wrote about time, and how it moves like water through fingers. He wrote about death, not as a threat, but as a boundary that made the present more real. And in the middle of this inner education, life did what it always does. It brought love in a complicated form. Marcus married Faustina the Younger, Antoninus's daughter, in an arrangement designed to strengthen the chain of succession. People later argued about Faustina, as people always argue about women who stand near power. Some stories paint her harshly. Some defend her. It is debated, and we cannot be sure what is gossip and what is truth. What seems clear is that Marcus, for all his philosophical restraint, and became attached to her in a way that mattered. They built a life in the imperial household, surrounded by servants and obligations and public expectation. Their private moments were likely small, a hand brushing another hand in a corridor, a glance exchanged during a ceremony. the brief calm of sitting together while distant voices carried through a doorway. And then came children. 13, by some counts. Not all would survive. That is the dark thread that runs through so much ancient life, even for the rich. Illness does not ask permission before it enters a home. A fever can lift a child's cheeks with false color, then drain it away by morning. Marcus learned, as a father, what he had learned as a son, that love is always paired with the possibility of loss. He tried to hold that truth the way you hold a clay cup, gently, aware it can crack. Parenthood changed his philosophy in a quiet way. Stoicism can sound hard if you read it without a human voice. It can sound like stone. But Marcus, holding his children, watching their small hands grasp at his fingers, could not pretend that emotion was something to be denied. Instead, he began to practice a softer discipline. Cherish what you have while you have it. Do not cling to it as if clinging could stop time. Love, and accept that love includes the risk of grief. These were not ideas he learned in books. They were lessons pressed into him by ordinary life. As the years passed, Antoninus relied more and more on Marcus. The apprenticeship became less theoretical. Marcus served as quaestor, praetor, consul, titles that sound like stones stacked in a line. Each one placed another weight on his shoulders. He sat in judgment. He listened to disputes. He learned how law is supposed to protect people and how it can be twisted. He learned that most problems do not come in clean shapes. They come tangled, carrying other problems inside them like hidden threads. He also learned humility, because no matter how intelligent you are, the empire is too large to be fully seen. A decision made in Rome can cause hunger in a distant province. A tax meant to fund roads can become a reason for resentment. A governor praised for efficiency can secretly be cruel. Marcus began to understand that leadership is often the art of choosing between imperfect options and then living with the consequences. The Stoic practice of focusing on what you can control became, for him, not a slogan, but a survival tool. He could not control weather. He could not control illness. He could not control the hidden ambitions of men who smiled and bowed, but he could control his own conduct, his own patience, his own willingness to listen. There were days, surely, when he wanted to run. Not physically, but in the mind. To retreat into a room with scrolls and silence and be only a philosopher. To step away from the endless requests, the endless ceremonies, the endless performance of authority. He did not run. He practiced staying. And that practice, repeated across years, shaped him into the kind of leader Hadrian had hoped for. By the time Antoninus died, Marcus had already been governing in all but name. The transition, when it came, was smooth. No civil war, no blood in the streets, just the quiet passing of a torch that had been carefully guarded. Yet Marcus knew something that made the calm feel fragile. Peace is not a gift the world gives once. It is a work that must be done again and again. On the eve of his accession, I like to imagine Marcus alone with a lamp, touching the ring that had belonged to his grandfather, feeling the cool metal, thinking of the chain of men who had taught him duty. The house around him would have been quiet, but not empty. The city beyond would have been breathing, restless, always hungry. He would have heard water in a fountain somewhere, and the sound might have reminded him that time moves whether you are ready or not. Soon, he would carry the title of emperor. Soon, he would discover that philosophy is easiest in a warm room, and hardest when the world is burning. And soon, he would make a decision that surprised Rome, a decision to share power, as if trying to split a storm in two, hoping it would become manageable. We will step into that moment next, slowly, with candlelight still in our hands. Sometimes Marcus would leave the bright rooms on purpose, not in rebellion, just in self-preservation. He would walk through a passage that servants rarely used, where the air smelled faintly of clay lamps and old wood, and where the wall plaster held small cracks like quiet maps. His footsteps made a soft tap, then a softer hush, as if the building itself were asking for calm. He would pause by a window and look down at Rome, a living animal curled beneath him, breathing smoke and music and argument. From up there, the city was a low tide of sound, not clear words, just the murmur, the way a distant crowd becomes almost like wind. Marcus would let that sound remind him of scale. 60 million lives, they said. Too many to hold in one mind. So the mind turns numbers into images. A river, a road, a field of candlelight. He would picture one candle in a far province he might never see. A mother bending close to it to mend a cloak. The emperor could not know their names, but his decisions touched their lives. That thought made him humble, and sometimes afraid. When the fear rose, he used the simplest tools his teachers had given him. He loosened his jaw. He slowed his breath until it matched the steady pace of his own steps. He reminded himself, quietly, that the only part of the empire fully inside his control was his own mind. Right now, in this hallway, there were nights when sleep would not come. The palace was never truly silent. Somewhere, a guard shifted his weight. Somewhere, a brazier settled with a faint crackle. Somewhere, water continued to run as if the city could not stop speaking. Marcus would sit up and take a wax tablet and write a line or two, not to create a masterpiece, but to empty his mind the way you empty a cup. Do not let praise soften you. Do not let insult harden you. Remember the dead, and remember you will join them. He would scratch these reminders into wax, then smooth them away, erasing and rewriting, as if his thoughts were a kind of clay he could knead into better shape. Honestly, I have always found it strange how lonely a crowded room can feel. You can stand among 100 people and still feel like you are the only one awake. Even so, the years under Antoninus were, by Roman standards, gentle. The empire held. It was as if the world granted Marcus one long inhale before the next storm. Soon, he would need that breath. The day Marcus became emperor did not feel like the beginning of a story. It felt like a door closing behind him. Antoninus Pius died peacefully, and Rome did what Rome always did when a ruler died. It moved quickly, efficiently, as if the machine feared hesitation. The Senate confirmed the succession with a smoothness that suggested years of preparation, and Marcus, now 39, found the title placed on him like a heavy cloak that was also, strangely, familiar. He had been rehearsing for this moment for decades. Still, knowing a thing is coming is not the same as feeling it arrive. That first night, I imagine him in a room lit by a single candle, the flame bending when a draft slipped under the door. Outside, the city continued. Inside, the emperor listened to his own breathing. He could have reached for celebration. He could have reached for pride. Instead, he reached for duty. And then, he did something Rome did not expect. He insisted that Lucius Verus, his adoptive brother, be named co-emperor with equal authority. Not a junior partner, not a decorative heir, an equal. For centuries, emperors had treated power like a single sword. Marcus treated it like a burden too heavy for one spine. Some senators thought he was weak. Some thought he was clever. Some thought the arrangement would tear the empire in half. Marcus thought, simply, that the empire was too vast and too complex to be governed well by one person. He also believed, quietly, that sharing power was a form of self-restraint. If you are serious about virtue, you do not cling to authority as if it were your natural right. You hold it as a trust, and you share the work when sharing is wiser than hoarding. Lucius had strengths, Marcus did not. He was more comfortable with the military. He could wear the public face of command with an ease that Marcus sometimes lacked. Marcus, in turn, focused on administration, law, the slow, careful tasks of keeping a civilization from cracking. For a while, it worked. The empire, for a brief moment, felt balanced, like a table with two strong legs instead of one trembling pillar. But balance is not the same as safety. In the middle of that early reign, something unseen began to move through the empire. It came, as so many catastrophes do, not as a roar, but as a whisper. A fever here, a cough there, a child suddenly quiet in a household that had been loud the day before. Merchants spoke of sick ports. Soldiers spoke of strange illness in the east. Then the whisper became a wave. What we call the Antonine Plague began to spread through Roman roads like water finding every crack. Scholars still debate exactly what disease it was. Some suggest smallpox. Others think measles. We cannot be certain. What is certain is the feeling it left behind, the sense of invisible danger moving faster than any army. The roads that made Rome powerful became the very veins that carried sickness. Marcus watched cities thin out. He watched trade slow. He watched the army weaken. People who had never thought about mortality began to smell it in the air, not as a scent, but as a presence, like dampness in walls. For a Stoic, this was not only a public crisis. It was a philosophical test. Stoicism teaches that the universe is ordered, that everything that happens is part of nature, and that our task is to respond with reason and virtue. It is easy to accept that idea when you are reading in a warm room. It is harder when you are looking at a line of grieving families and you can do almost nothing to stop the losses. Marcus did not retreat. He opened granaries. He funded relief with his own wealth. He supported physicians and healers. He stayed visible in Rome when he could have fled to a safer villa. He did not pretend he could fix everything. He tried, instead, to act well within what was possible. There is a kind of courage that looks like continuing to show up, not glamorous, not loud, just present. And then, as if plague were not enough, the empire faced war. The Parthian Empire, Rome's great rival in the east, moved into Armenia and threatened Syria. It was a challenge that demanded military leadership. Marcus sent Lucius east, trusting him with the campaign while he remained to manage the complex heart of the empire. This is where the dual rule proved its value. Lucius could focus on the front. Marcus could focus on keeping the imperial body supplied, organized, fed. He coordinated logistics, money, appointments, messages. He listened to reports that came like dried leaves, one after another, carrying both facts and fear. In the east, Lucius achieved victories, and by Roman standards, the campaign ended in success. Armenia was restored. Parthian cities were punished. The empire's pride was patched. But the victory carried a hidden poison. The returning legions brought illness with them, spreading the plague further, deeper, westward. Sometimes I think about that image. Soldiers marching home, dust on their sandals, sunlight on their armor, relief in their faces, and inside their bodies, inside their packs, something invisible traveling with them. War and disease, moving together like twin shadows. Not long after, Lucius fell ill and died in 169. Marcus lost a partner and a friend, and Rome lost the balance it had briefly held. Grief, for Marcus, was not theatrical. He had learned too early that grief does not always come with dramatic gestures. Sometimes it comes as a quiet heaviness in the chest while you still have to attend meetings, still have to sign documents, still have to listen to men argue about taxes while you want to sit alone and remember a face. Lucius's death left Marcus with a decision. He could name a new co-emperor, risking rivalry, suspicion, a split in loyalty. Or he could rule alone. After deliberation, he chose to rule alone, not out of pride, but out of necessity, and perhaps out of a stoic acceptance that the role had returned to him in full. If fate had removed his partner, then fate was asking him to carry the whole weight. He carried it. He wrote more in his private journal during this period. Not for the world, for himself. The writing became a small torch in a dark corridor. He reminded himself not to become hardened. He reminded himself to treat people as fellow travelers, not as tools. He reminded himself that power isolates, and that isolation is a danger. When you cannot speak honestly to anyone, you begin to lie to yourself. He fought that danger with attention, with humility, with the daily effort to see things as they were. Yet the world did not let him remain in the center of Rome for long. Beyond the northern frontier, along the Danube, pressure was building. Germanic tribes, pushed by forces Rome did not fully understand. Population shifts, environmental changes, hunger, fear. began probing the border. At first it was raids. Then it was something more coordinated, more alarming, as if many separate fires were learning how to become one. Reports arrived in Rome with the dry language of administration, but underneath you could hear the panic. Fortresses threatened, villages burned, garrisons stretched thin. Marcus faced another decision. He could stay in Rome and send generals to handle it. Many emperors would have. But Marcus's sense of duty, that quiet inner command, did not allow the comfortable choice. He believed that if he asked men to endure mud and cold and fear, he should share it. He believed that leadership is not only issuing orders, it is standing where the consequences are. So he prepared to leave the marble heart of the empire. I imagine the preparation as slow and intimate, not a grand parade, but a series of small acts. A servant folding a cloak, a hand tying a strap, a candle burning down as maps are spread on a table, a child asleep nearby, unaware that their father's life is about to move into a different landscape. Marcus would have looked at his family and felt the familiar ache, the love that makes duty more painful, not less. He would have kissed foreheads, perhaps, and tasted the salt of his own thoughts. He would have stepped out into the Roman night and heard water in the fountains, steady as ever, and he would have known that Rome could continue without him, but the frontier might not. The journey north would show him an empire changing. He would travel through towns weakened by plague, fields left fallow, roads lined with weary faces. He would see the difference between the idea of Rome and the reality of its people, the quiet endurance that holds a civilization together when the banners mean little. He would also feel the air change, warmer, turning to colder, the smell of stone shifting, the light thinning as he moved toward the edge of the world, Rome claimed. And when he finally reached the Danube, he would discover that philosophy does not end in a book. It continues in a tent, by candlelight, while enemies gather beyond a river that breathes in the dark. We will follow him there next, letting the road stretch, letting the footsteps slow, letting the cold air arrive gently. Before the departure, there were ceremonies. Of course. Rome loves ritual the way stone loves being carved. It is how the city makes chaos feel shaped. Marcus stood in formal rooms while men spoke of stability, but his mind kept returning to quieter images. A hospital room where the air smelled of vinegar and sweat. A street where shutters were closed because a household had been struck by fever. The empire was not only marble, it was also the cramped stairwells of tenements and the kitchens where the poor boiled thin soup. In his private notes, he forced himself to look straight at that reality. Look at life as it is. Do not decorate it. The plague had made even the rich feel fragile. It slipped under doors guards could not truly defend. In that climate, rumors grew. Some blamed foreign gods. Some blamed Christians. Some blamed moral decline. Marcus listened, but he refused to build policy on scapegoats. The temptation to sacrifice an easy target is always strongest when the world feels out of control. When he decided to go north, he did not announce it with triumph. He announced it with necessity. Presence has power. A general can command. An emperor can embody. The journey began before dawn. Torches smoked. Horses shifted their weight. Leather creaked. Marcus stepped through the gate, and the first sound was simple. Just footsteps on stone, repeating, steady, becoming the rhythm of departure. Roads stretched ahead, and the empire revealed itself in layers. In one town, a market tried to function with half the usual crowd, voices softer, eyes wary. In another, doors were marked quietly in a way that suggested sickness inside. People watched the emperor pass from a careful distance, as if they did not know whether to hope or to fear. He stopped often, not for spectacle, but for listening. A farmer, explaining that neighbors had died and fields lay untended. A local official begging for grain. A centurion reporting men were tired and replacements slow. Each request was a small stone placed in Marcus's hands, and he carried them all, at least for a moment. There were also brief silences that felt like mercy. A stream under a bridge, water clear over pale stones. A roadside shrine where a candle burned stubbornly against the wind. A child holding out a flower without understanding the politics of it. As days passed, the air changed. The smell of land shifted from urban smoke to open soil. Dust rose from the road and settled on cloaks and letters. At night, in a plain tent, Marcus returned to his writing. Not because he wanted to be remembered, but because he needed to remember himself. The low voices of soldiers outside carried like a museum, hush made of living breath. Somewhere ahead was the Danube, a boundary line that felt like a slow inhale in the dark. When the first cold mornings arrived, Marcus felt them in his bones. He cupped his hands near a brazier and watched heat ripple the air, thinking how quickly warmth can vanish. By the time the frontier forts appeared as dark shapes against gray sky, Marcus was no longer in the world of marble halls. He was entering the world of mud, smoke, and watchfires. We will sit with him there. On the last stretch of road, he began to hear the river even before he saw it. Not as a clear sound, but as a faint presence, like wind moving through reeds. He imagined the water dark and wide, carrying leaves, carrying silt, carrying the quiet histories of villages upstream. A river does not care for borders. It simply moves. Marcus wondered, in a tired corner of his mind, whether empires are more like rivers than like walls, always changing shape, always flowing, always eroding what seems permanent. And still, he would bring a small candle into the tent each night, a human flame against the vast, indifferent cold. Outside, the Danube frontier did not welcome Marcus with ceremony. It welcomed him with weather, cold air that tasted like iron, wind that moved through bare branches with a restless whisper, a sky that seemed lower than the Roman sky, heavy with pale light, as if the sun here had to work harder to be seen. When the imperial entourage arrived at the first major fortress, the stones were damp, and the smell of wet earth rose from the ditches like a slow breath. Marcus stepped down from his carriage and felt the ground under his sandals change. In Rome, stone had been smooth, polished by countless feet. Here, the earth was uneven, compacted by boots and hooves, and where there was stone, it was rough, practical, meant to stop an enemy, not to impress a visitor. He listened. There was always noise in a military camp, but it was a different kind of noise from the city. Not the arguments of merchants or the laughter of crowds. This was the sound of discipline. Metal clinking softly as men adjusted armor. A cough from somewhere behind a tent. A distant hammer on wood. A low murmur of voices that carried the hush of a museum, not because it was quiet, but because the people knew what was at stake. At night, the camp smelled of smoke and boiled grain, and the faint sourness of wet leather drying too slowly. Fires burned in braziers, and their light trembled on faces. Marcus sat in his command tent, where maps were spread like pale skins across a table, and he watched the candle flame bend with every draft. He had read reports in Rome. He had listened to generals speak. But standing here, feeling the cold, hearing the river, he understood something that words cannot deliver. The frontier was not a line. It was a living wound that had to be watched constantly, because it would close and open again depending on pressure, hunger, fear, and the decisions of men who were never fully predictable. In the months before his arrival, the tribes beyond the river had begun to move in ways the Romans did not expect. What had once been separate groups, each with their own rivalries, had started to coordinate. The Marcomanni, the Quadi, the Sarmatians, and others formed confederations, a kind of temporary unity driven by shared necessity. Some scholars suggest environmental pressures, colder seasons, shifting harvests, population growth. We cannot be sure of every cause, but the result was clear. More people were pressing toward Roman land. More raids. More testing of weak points. More rumors of larger gatherings of warriors. Marcus met with commanders who had been living this reality for years. Their faces were lined in a way that was not only age but weather. They spoke in the careful tone of men who had learned that optimism can be dangerous. They pointed to places on the map where the river could be crossed at shallow points. They named fortresses that were understaffed. They described how the tribes had learned, over generations, by watching Rome. They had studied Roman tactics. They had begun building siege equipment. They had begun fighting not as scattered raiders, but as coordinated enemies who could strike multiple points at once. Marcus listened with the patience he had learned in Senate meetings. Yet inside, he felt a quiet pressure building. He had spent his youth learning how to govern. Now, he had to learn how to defend. There is a moment, sometimes, when a person realizes that their education has been insufficient, not because their teachers failed, but because life has moved beyond the classroom. Marcus felt that moment on the frontier. Still, he could not allow it to show his panic. He had soldiers watching him, officers waiting for the tone of his voice to tell them whether the world was safe. Marcus knew that leadership is sometimes the art of being calm in public while you tremble in private. He chose to lead from the front, not recklessly, not as a man seeking glory, but as a man obeying an inner command. If he had asked these men to endure hardship, he would share it. If he had spoken so often of duty, he would not hide behind others when duty became cold and dangerous. So, when the first major engagement came, Marcus insisted on being present. The battle near Carnuntum became a dark lesson. The Romans had expected to meet scattered forces, to bring their heavy infantry discipline into play, to push back the pressure with order and training. But the enemy chose ground that did not favor Rome. The terrain broke up formations. The river and the marshy edges became traps. The tribes fought with desperate fury, not as men seeking a quick raid, but as men fighting for survival and future land. Marcus watched as cohorts were surrounded. He watched as signals became confused. A messenger arrived with mud on his boots and fear in his eyes, speaking too fast, struggling to breathe. Somewhere, a horn blew and then stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed felt worse than the sound. The famous Roman discipline held, and then it frayed. Not because the soldiers lacked courage, but because circumstances can stretch any system beyond what it was built to endure. When night fell, Marcus returned to his tent with a heaviness that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. He had lost men. Thousands, perhaps. Numbers are debated, and ancient reporting is often unreliable. But the reality of the loss was present in the camp. Fires burned low. Faces were hollow. The air smelled of damp earth and iron, and the river beyond the fortifications moved with its indifferent breath. In his private hours, Marcus wrote, not for history, not for an audience, for himself, because he needed a place to put the weight that could not be spoken aloud. He wrote about failure. He wrote about how quickly morning confidence can become evening ruin. He wrote about how the universe does not guarantee success, only the chance to act well. He reminded himself that Stoicism is not a charm that prevents disaster. It is a way of standing inside disaster without letting it destroy your character. That night, he did not sleep easily. The camp was full of small sounds. A guard's foot shifting on frozen ground. A horse snorting softly. A distant cough. The faint creak of leather. It all blended into a low hush that felt like the world holding its breath. In the following months, Marcus did what he always did when confronted with his own ignorance. He learned. He approached warfare the way he had approached philosophy, with humility and persistence. He spoke with veteran centurions who had survived battles by paying attention to small details. He listened to engineers about fortifications, ditches, palisades, the way water could be used as a barrier or a trap. He studied the patterns of tribal movement, trying to understand not only where they were, but why. And he learned to delegate. That was perhaps his most important change. Marcus was not a genius on horseback, not a natural commander in the style of Caesar. His strength was in judgment, in endurance, in the ability to hold many threads at once. He began to trust generals with tactical decisions while he focused on strategy, logistics, the vast work of keeping an army alive through winter. Winter on the Danube was not an idea. It was a physical presence. Frost on tent ropes, breath visible in the air, water freezing in shallow bowls, soldiers wrapping cloaks tighter and still feeling cold in their bones. Marcus lived among them, not in absolute misery, but without the luxury Rome could have offered. He ate the same rations. He slept in a tent where the wind found every seam. He wrote by candlelight while outside the world was white and silent. The meditations that would later be called his meditations began to deepen here. The frontier gave his philosophy edges. He wrote about anger, how easily it rises when you are cold and tired. He wrote about compassion, how easily it fades when you are forced to make life and death decisions daily. He wrote about the importance of seeing even an enemy as a human being, because to see them as a monster is to begin becoming a monster yourself. These were difficult truths to hold in a war. There were days when plague still haunted the camps. Illness moved among soldiers in waves. Marcus did not flee. He visited the sick, spoke to them, listened to their voices grow thin. He supported medical care, whatever could be done in that age. He knew many would still die. He kept his face calm, but in his private notes, he wrote about mortality with a quiet intensity. A man can command legions and still be helpless against fever. The war dragged on. It was not a single heroic campaign. It was a grind. Advance. Retreat. Negotiation. Betrayal. Winter. Spring. Another push. Another raid. Another treaty. Another broken promise. Marcus found that the tribes, like Rome, were not one mind. They were many minds bound together by temporary necessity. When Rome showed strength and persistence, confederations began to fray. Some tribes sought separate peace. Others continued to fight. Marcus used diplomacy when possible and force when necessary. His commitment to justice became known. He insisted on proper treatment of captives, to the frustration of some soldiers who wanted quick revenge. He did not always succeed in preventing harshness. War has its own momentum, and it can pull even a good man toward brutality if he is not careful. Marcus wrote about that danger as if he were speaking to himself in the dark. Do not let the war make you smaller. Do not let the war steal your humanity. At the same time, the empire did not stop needing an emperor. From the frontier, Marcus still governed. Messages arrived daily. Petitions. Legal disputes. Appointments. Tax issues. Reports of unrest in cities strained by plague and economic strain. Marcus sat with scrolls and listened to advisors, then made decisions that rippled across provinces he could not see. Sometimes he would pause, holding a stylus, and feel the absurdity of it. A man in a cold tent deciding the fate of people living in warm deserts far away. This is where his stoic cosmic perspective became more than philosophy. It became a way to avoid drowning. He reminded himself that his role was one small part of a larger whole, that the universe would continue after him, that his task was not to control everything, but to act well in the small circle of what he could touch. And then, amid all this, personal grief found him again. News traveled slowly, but it traveled. A child sick in Rome. A child dead. The names of his children, once spoken in laughter, began to carry the edge of loss. He learned of deaths the way he learned of military casualties, through letters. Ink on parchment, a seal broken, the words inside changing his world with quiet cruelty. He did not have the luxury of proper mourning. He had soldiers to command and provinces to govern. He carried grief the way he carried everything, inside, carefully, like a fragile cup. In winter, when the camp was quieter, He would sometimes stand outside his tent and listen to the river. The Danube was dark under moonlight. Its surface moved with slow certainty. Marcus would watch it and think of time, how it flows regardless of what we build beside it, how it carries away footprints, how it continues while men fight on its banks. He would pull his cloak tighter and go back inside to the candle, to the page, to the small work of keeping his soul steady. The war was shaping him, hardening him, but also, strangely, clarifying him. Philosophy was no longer a set of ideas. It was a practice repeated every day in cold air, under pressure, with lives depending on it. And even as Marcus learned to survive the war, he began to consider something that would later be judged as both bold and dangerous. A way to end the cycle, not by pushing enemies away forever, because forever does not exist in politics, but by absorbing them. We will move toward that thought next, slowly, as the river continues to breathe outside the tent and the candle continues to burn down, one small flame measuring the night. Before dawn, sometimes, Marcus walked the perimeter with only a few guards at a respectful distance. Footsteps on packed soil, the faint crunch where frost had formed a thin skin over puddles, the smell of smoke still clinging to his cloak. He would touch the rough timber of the palisade and feel the grain beneath his fingers, as if the wood itself held a memory of every night it had stood between life and the dark. At a watchtower, he would pause and look out toward the far bank, where mist gathered low over the water, like a blanket being pulled gently into place. Somewhere beyond, unseen fires might be burning, other men breathing in other tents, listening to the same wind. It always struck him, that symmetry. The enemy was not a beast. The enemy was another group of human hearts trying to survive. When he returned to his tent, the lamp would still be burning. Dust from the road, from boots, from the dry edges of the camp, would float through the narrow beam of light, turning the air into a slow snowfall. Marcus would sit again, shoulders heavy, and write one more line for himself, not as an order, but as a whisper. Hold steady. And begin again. When you live beside a river long enough, you begin to understand how it teaches. Water does not argue with stone. It simply continues. It wears a path by patience, not by rage. And Marcus, watching the Danube day after day, began to feel that patience settling into him, as if the frontier itself were schooling him in a different kind of strength. After the disaster near Carnuntum, he stopped thinking in single battles. He started thinking in seasons. A raid in spring meant hungry tribes testing the softness of thawing roads. An uneasy quiet in summer meant gatherings in the forests, men assembling, promises being made. Autumn brought sharper winds, and with them the pressure of harvests, of food stores, of decisions that would determine whether a people endured the winter. Rome had spent centuries meeting pressure with force, then going home. But Marcus sensed that the frontier had changed. The tribes were no longer just distant shadows. They were neighbors pressed close by the same deep time that presses everyone eventually. They would not vanish. If Rome pushed them back, they would return later, driven again by hunger, climate, ambition, and fear. He began to consider an idea that sounded, to many Romans, like a betrayal. What if the answer was not endless pushing? What if the answer was incorporation? Not because Marcus was naive about danger, but because he was tired of the cycle that kept feeding itself. Each victory created resentment. Each harsh punishment created future enemies. Each decade of peace ended when a new generation grew up with old injuries in their stories. The Stoics taught him to see humanity as one body, each person a part of a larger whole. That teaching was easy to admire in a lecture hall. It was harder to hold when you stood on a watchtower staring into the dark beyond the river. Yet Marcus tried. He started with small steps. After major engagements, when tribes sued for peace, he did not always demand only humiliation and tribute. Sometimes, he offered terms that included settlement, land within the empire, in regions that were underpopulated after plague, obligations to provide soldiers for Roman service. A gradual path, at least in theory, into the structure of Roman law. Some senators in Rome would have called it madness. Some soldiers called it dangerous softness. And honestly, Marcus himself did not know if it would work. He was experimenting with the future while standing in the mud of the present. But he had watched the empire bleed. He had watched cities thin out, markets slow, villages go quiet. The plague had taken people. The war had taken people. Rome needed bodies, not just to fight, but to farm, to build, to keep the machinery of civilization moving. The enemy had bodies. The enemy also had fear, pride, and a long memory. Those things could not be erased by a treaty. But perhaps they could be reshaped by time. So Marcus built time into his policy. He instructed his governors to settle certain groups at a distance from major cities, in places where they could farm, where they would be watched, where they would be offered a stake. He ordered that their leaders be treated with measured respect, not flattery, not humiliation, something in between. He insisted on hostages sometimes. Yes, because he was not romantic about peace. Yet he tried to make those hostages a bridge, not a chain, allowing them to see Roman life, Roman law, Roman habits. Some tribes accepted. Others pretended to accept, then returned to raiding. Marcus learned again, quietly, that no policy is pure. Every choice is made among imperfect options. In his tent, by candlelight, he wrote reminders to himself about anger. Anger feels like clarity. Anger feels like strength. But anger is often just pain trying to turn into something else. He wrote about the temptation to become hardened. He wrote about how a ruler, forced to say yes and no to suffering daily, can begin to lose the ability to feel. He told himself, again and again, to keep the inner chamber of his mind clean, even when the outer world was full of smoke and noise. There were nights when the camp was so still that he could hear the river changing its sound, not the loud rush of spring melt, but the low, dark sliding of winter water, moving under thin ice, as if the river were speaking in a softer voice. Marcus would sit with his cloak around his shoulders, the air tasting of ash, and he would read old notes he had written years earlier in Rome. He noticed how different they sounded now. Back then, he had written as a man preparing for hardship. Now he wrote as a man living inside it. His philosophy became less like a tower and more like a fire. Small, practical, something you keep alive by tending it constantly, feeding it carefully, shielding it from wind. He kept tending it even when fresh losses arrived. Letters from Rome, a friend sick, a child gone, a report of unrest in a province, a request for judgment in a legal dispute that involved people he would never meet. He was always being asked to decide. He began to understand the loneliness of command in a new way. In Rome, he had had Lucius Verus for a time, a partner in the burden, someone who could take one half of the weight. Now, alone on the frontier, Marcus felt how power isolates. The higher you stand, the fewer people can speak to you with complete honesty. Everyone worries about consequences, about the emperor's mood, about their own position. The tent, with its thin canvas walls, became a strange symbol. Outside, thousands of men and horses and fires. Inside, one man with a candle and a page, trying to keep his soul straight. He would sometimes ask an advisor to stay late, to talk in a less formal way, to tell him what he truly thought. Some did. Many could not, even if they wanted to. Fear is a habit, and the imperial court taught fear well. So Marcus relied on his writing. His private words became a second counselor, a quiet voice that could tell him the truth without flattery. He wrote about death with an intimacy that was not morbid, just honest. Death was everywhere on the frontier. Not always dramatic. Sometimes it was a cough that turned into silence. Sometimes it was a fall from a horse. Sometimes it was a fever that took a man in 2 days. Marcus began to think of death not as an interruption, but as a constant companion. And that thought, strangely, made him gentler. If life was brief, then cruelty was an unnecessary weight. If everything passed, then justice mattered even more. Still, he could not escape the fact that he was fighting a war. Mercy had limits, and he knew those limits were part of his duty. When a group broke a treaty and attacked Roman civilians, Marcus ordered swift retaliation. He did not enjoy it. He did not pretend it was beautiful. He did it because a ruler who cannot protect the vulnerable is not truly a ruler, only a philosopher daydreaming. Even then, he insisted on boundaries. He demanded discipline. He punished soldiers who committed needless cruelty. Not always perfectly. No one could enforce perfection across miles of frontier and thousands of hungry men. But he tried, and trying became, for him, a kind of prayer. As the years moved forward, the Confederation pressure began to lessen. Not because the tribes became peaceful by nature, but because Rome refused to break. Rome adapted. Rome negotiated. Rome struck back, and Marcus, by sheer endurance, became a presence the tribes had to account for. An emperor who did not vanish back to Rome. An emperor who stayed. That alone changed the tone of the war. Soldiers felt it, too. They had served under rulers who treated them like distant tools. Marcus treated them like human beings, and it created a different loyalty. Not the frantic loyalty of fear, but the steady loyalty of respect. He visited field hospitals. He spoke to wounded men, not in grand speeches, but with quiet attention. He established funds to support families of those who died. He did these things because Stoicism, to him, was never supposed to be cold. It was supposed to be humane, a discipline that makes you less selfish, not more distant. Over time, the war shifted towards something that looked like stability. Not peace. Exactly. A temporary breathing space. Some tribes were pushed back. Others were settled. The frontier was strengthened with fortifications and roads. Supplies were better organized. Marcus had learned, painfully, how to feed an army through winter, how to keep men from starving or freezing, how to maintain morale when all the world looked gray. He wrote one winter, when snow drifted against the tent walls and the candles sputtered, about the strange gift of hardship. Hardship strips away the unnecessary. It reveals what you truly are. That thought comforted him on nights when he felt old, when his body ached, when he sensed how the years of cold and stress were aging him faster than time alone would have. He was not a young emperor now. His hair had turned fully gray. His face was drawn, lined by weather and worry. Some chronic illness had followed him for years, and it did not leave. He endured it the way he endured everything, quietly, without making his pain into a spectacle. The camp physicians tried herbs and diets and rest, but rest was not something the frontier offered easily. In those later years, another shadow began to form, not beyond the river, but within his own household. His son, Commodus. Marcus had hoped, once, that he might raise a child to share the burden with him, to understand the difference between power and vanity. But Commodus had been raised in the court, surrounded by luxury. Even when Marcus tried to bring him closer to real duty, the boy seemed drawn to glitter. He liked the spectacle of authority. He liked how people fell silent when he entered. He was fascinated by gladiators, by the show of strength without the slow labor of virtue behind it. You know that feeling when you watch someone you love walk toward a door you are afraid they will open. And you cannot stop them, because they think the door leads to something wonderful. Marcus felt that. He watched Commodus and felt a slow fear that did not shout, but lingered. Still, the empire needed continuity. The Senate and the army wanted a clear line. Marcus knew that a contested succession could tear Rome apart more quickly than any barbarian raid. In trying to prevent one catastrophe, he might be setting the stage for another. That is the tragedy of leadership. Sometimes, you must choose the least awful option and live with the taste of it. In his private writing, Marcus did not excuse himself. He did not pretend that fate would automatically correct what he could not. He simply reminded himself, again, of his role. You are an actor in a play. Epictetus had said, you do not choose your part, but you can choose how well you perform it. Marcus performed. He continued to negotiate, to fortify, to govern, to write. He continued to wake before dawn, when the camp was still asleep and only the river moved. and he would sit in the small pool of lamplight while dust drifted slowly through it, making the air look like a quiet sky full of falling stars. He would write one line, then another. Then he would breathe, slow and deep, and step back into the day, because the war was not truly over yet. It was only pausing, and Marcus, carrying his philosophy like a small flame through cold wind, would have to walk into the next phase with the same steady feet, listening to the river, listening to the hush, preparing, always preparing, for whatever the world would ask of him next. There was one evening, late in the campaigning years, when a tribal delegation came under a flag of truce. They arrived slowly, cautious, as if every step across Roman ground might trigger a hidden snare. Their leader was tall, wrapped in furs, hair braided tight, eyes scanning the camp with a mixture of suspicion and exhausted curiosity. He had brought gifts, a bundle of worked leather, a small piece of amber that caught the candlelight like trapped honey. Marcus met them in a plain tent, not in a gilded hall. He wanted no theater, only talk. A brazier glowed in the corner. The air smelled of smoke and damp wool. Interpreters stood close, careful with every word. Outside, guards moved in soft patterns, footsteps measured. The way people move in a place where the night is never fully safe. The chieftain spoke of his people's hunger, of children, of elders who remembered winters when the snow did not stop. He spoke of pressure from other tribes, of the way fear spreads faster than any messenger. Marcus listened and felt the strange closeness of it. Different languages, different gods, yet the same basic story. Survival. When Marcus finally spoke, his voice was quiet. He offered land, yes, and conditions, yes. Service, yes. He also offered something rarer, a chance to stop being hunted by the same wheel of retaliation. The chieftain did not look grateful. He looked uncertain, as if he suspected a hidden knife. Marcus understood. Trust is not given easily between enemies. It has to be grown, like a crop, season by season, and the soil of war is thin. When they left, the tent felt colder. Marcus sat alone for a moment, watching the ember glow, and he realized how fragile civilization really is, how it depends on small agreements held together by tired men who would rather sleep than fight. He wrote that night about the illusion of permanence. Even Rome, with its marble, was only dust waiting for time. The river would still flow when the tents were gone. And yet, for now, he could still choose what kind of ruler he would be. For now, he could still keep the flame steady. The winter that came to the Danube in Marcus's final years felt quieter than the winters before. Not because the war had ended completely, but because fatigue had soaked into everything. The soldiers still drilled, still patrolled the walls, still listened for distant movement beyond the river. Yet the camp carried a different rhythm now, slower, as if even the wind had learned the weight of long campaigning. Snow gathered in the corners of palisades. Frost held the tent ropes stiff. When Marcus inhaled in the pre-dawn dark, the cold air seemed to scrape gently along his throat, reminding him that the body is always temporary. even when the mind tries to pretend otherwise. He woke before sunrise the way he always had, but the act of rising had become a negotiation. A pause. A breath. The slow swing of feet to the ground. The slight tremor in his hands as he reached for his cloak. His physicians watched him with the careful eyes of people who have run out of clever solutions. They spoke softly about rest, about warmth, about returning south. Marcus listened, then shook his head with the same quiet stubbornness he had shown for years. If the frontier could not rest, neither could he. And yet, he knew he was changing. His illnesses were no longer minor inconveniences. They were constant companions. Some days a dull ache settled in his belly. Some days nausea arrived without warning. Some days he felt the strange hollow fatigue that comes when the body is fighting something it cannot name. The Romans did not have the words we have now for certain diseases, so we can only infer from fragments. It is debated what exactly was consuming him. But whatever it was narrowing his world to smaller and smaller circles. Still, his mind remained clear. That clarity, in a way, was its own kind of eerie blessing. He could feel his life approaching its edge, and he could look directly at it. As a philosopher, as a man, as an emperor who had seen too many edges already. In the camp, the candlelight never stopped. There was always a lamp burning somewhere, someone writing, someone counting supplies, someone copying orders. Marcus's own tent became a small island of light in an ocean of cold darkness. When he sat at his writing desk, the flame threw a warm glow over the page and made the dust in the air visible. Tiny particles floating like slow snow. He would watch them for a moment, drifting without direction, and he would think about how people drift too, carried by forces they rarely understand. He wrote reminders to himself, not as a performance, but as a private tether. Do not resent what you must do. Do not seek praise. Do not let comfort become your master. Be kind without becoming weak. He wrote about the loneliness of power again, because it kept returning like a thought you cannot fully dismiss. He could speak to generals, to senators in distant letters, to envoys, to priests, to his own family. Yet there were things he could not share with anyone. The deep private fear that his son might not be fit. The quiet grief that he could not stop collecting. The awareness that he had tried to be good and might still fail at the final task of passing the empire on safely. Commodus had arrived at the frontier as Marcus had insisted, meant to see hardship, meant to taste duty like unsweetened bread. And Commodus did see it. He saw the mud. He saw the frost. He saw the scarred faces of veterans. He watched drills and inspections. He stood beside his father during audiences with tribal leaders. He listened to the slow grinding logic of war, where victory is rarely clean and peace is rarely permanent. But what Commodus loved was not the labor. He loved the theater. He loved the moment when officers saluted him, the way voices lowered, the way eyes turned, the instant obedience that came with his name. He was drawn to the stories of gladiators the way a moth is drawn to flame, fascinated by the idea of strength displayed as spectacle, controlled, applauded, and then forgotten. Marcus watched this with a sadness he rarely allowed himself to show. Honestly, It is one of the strangest pains in human life. To see a child inherit everything you can offer and still reach for something emptier. Marcus tried to teach in the only way he knew. Not by shouting, not by forcing, but by example and by patient conversation. He would invite Commodus to sit with him in the quiet hours, when the camp was still, when the river sounded like a long, steady sigh beyond the walls. He would speak about duty as service, about how power is a loan from the world, not a prize, about how a ruler should fear his own impulses more than any enemy beyond the border. Commodus would nod. Sometimes he would even ask questions that sounded thoughtful. But Marcus felt the hollowness behind the responses. The way you can feel a room is cold, even when the fire burns. The boy's attention drifted toward the next entertainment, the next admiration, the next proof that he mattered. And Marcus could not erase the fact that the empire needed continuity. The Senate wanted a clear line. The army wanted to know whose name they would shout when the old emperor was gone. Marcus understood those fears. He had seen what contested succession could do. Blood, chaos, provinces choosing sides, generals declaring themselves saviors. So he confirmed Commodus as heir. Not because he was blind, but because he was trapped between disasters. It was a choice made with a heavy hand and a heavy heart. In private, Marcus began drafting instructions. Not public decrees. Personal guidance. Notes that might help his son govern, if his son chose to listen. He wrote about listening to competent advisors, about avoiding flatterers, about keeping the Praetorian Guard in check, about spending money on necessities before pleasures, about honoring the law, about remembering that even an emperor is only a man. He wrote these things as if he were carving them into stone, because the written word felt like one last tool he could still use. There were days when he could not work. On those days, he would lie back on his bedroll, eyes half closed, listening to the small sounds of the camp. The crackle of a brazier, the faint clink of a cup being set down, a guard clearing his throat outside the tent. Sometimes, far away, a horse would stamp its hoof. Impatient with stillness, Marcus would breathe slowly, the way he had taught himself to do when pressure rose. Inhale, exhale. Feel the jaw soften. Feel the shoulders lower. Let the mind rest in the space between thoughts. He had learned that calm is not something you find. It is something you build, breath by breath. When he was strong enough, he continued meeting petitioners. He continued hearing legal cases. Even on the frontier, people brought disputes to the emperor. A soldier accused of theft, a merchant claiming unfair treatment, a village asking for relief after raids. Marcus listened with the same careful attention he had once given in Rome, because he believed justice was not a decoration. It was the spine of civilization. Sometimes he would look up from a petition and see Commodus watching, bored, restless, waiting for the moment to pass. Marcus would feel the chill of that, deeper than the winter air. And still, he kept going. The war itself shifted again, as wars do. Some tribes remained quiet. Others tested the border. Marcus authorized limited campaigns. Pressure rather than conquest. He still considered the policy of settlement and integration, though he knew future emperors might not handle it with the same restraint. A policy is only as wise as the hand that holds it. One night, after a day of meetings, Marcus walked slowly along the rampart. He needed air. The sky was clear, hard with stars. The snow reflected pale light, turning the world into a muted landscape, almost gentle. The Danube moved darkly below, its surface carrying small sheets of ice like floating shards of glass. If you were standing there with me, you would have heard how quiet it was, the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. Marcus paused near a watchtower and rested his hand on the cold stone. He felt its roughness, its permanence, and he thought about how even stone is not permanent. Time will grind it to powder. Empires are no different. He returned to his tent and wrote a short note. Everything you protect will eventually become dust. Protect it anyway. In the following weeks, his condition worsened. He began to withdraw from inspections. He spent more time seated, wrapped in blankets, watching the flame. His advisors became more urgent, his physicians more grave, Commodus more impatient. Marcus knew what was happening. The frontier was no longer his battlefield. His body was, and the final campaign would not be won by force, only met with dignity. He began to prepare, not with grand ceremonies, but with small acts. He arranged bonuses for the troops. He confirmed appointments. He ensured that orders were clear. He spoke with commanders, transferring responsibilities gradually, the way a man hands a fragile object to another, careful not to drop it. He also wrote more often, as if he could pour what remained of his strength into words. Death is natural. What matters is to have lived in accordance with reason. Do not cling. Be grateful. Be ready. Outside, the river continued to breathe, indifferent, steady. Inside, the candle burned down slowly, measuring the night. And Marcus, the philosopher-emperor, sat very still, feeling the boundary draw closer, and trying, as he had always tried, to cross it without fear, leaving behind not perfection, but an example of a human being who kept choosing virtue, even when the world was cold. When spring began to soften the snow, Marcus insisted on visiting the line one more time. Not for drama, just to see it with his own eyes. Mud took the place of ice, and the camp smelled of wet leather and smoke. During a siege beyond the river, he walked a short stretch of rampart, one careful step after another, hand brushing the timber rail as if it were a friend. Halfway along, his breath shortened. The world tilted. He sat down in the mud without ceremony, cloak darkening where it touched the earth. Officers moved to lift him, and he let them, finally, because even stubbornness has a limit. That night, with the lamp low, he wrote a simple line. The body will stop whether you approve or not. Let it stop with dignity. His physicians urged Vindobona, a stronger fortress where he could be cared for. Marcus agreed, but only after he spoke privately with commanders, passing responsibilities like a fragile cup from hand to hand. He wanted no sudden gap, no confusion. The journey was slow. Sometimes he walked a few steps to prove he still could. Sometimes he rode in silence, listening to wheels and ruts, to the faint rattle of metal, to the river's distant breath. In Vindobona, the walls were thick. The corridors smelled of stone and old smoke, and the nights felt endless. Marcus returned to his writing before dawn, even when his hand shook, even when ink pooled into dark little islands on the page. He listened to his breathing the way a man listens to weather, patiently, without bargaining. Outside, guards changed shifts. Boots passed. A spear tapped once against the ground. The empire continued its routines, as if routine could hold back the inevitable. And Marcus, wrapped in wool, watched the candle flame bend and straighten, and he felt the boundary drawing nearer, not like an enemy, but like a door he had always known would open. Commodus came to him there, wearing a cloak too fine for the fortress, smelling faintly of oil and perfume that did not belong in a place of iron and mud. The contrast was almost painful. Marcus asked him to sit. They spoke quietly, with only the fire's soft crackle between their words. Marcus tried one last time to describe the empire as responsibility, not possession. He spoke of soldiers whose hands were split from cold, of farmers planting under threat, of governors deciding justice in distant towns. He reminded his son that an emperor's desires are never private. They spill outward, touching millions. Commodus listened. He nodded. He said the right phrases. Yet Marcus felt, beneath the surface, the boy's impatience, like a foot tapping behind a curtain, the longing for applause, the hunger for spectacle. Marcus did not accuse. He only watched, and in that watching, he felt the quiet dread that comes when you know you cannot control the next chapter. When Commodus left, Marcus stayed by the flame a long time, staring at the dust drifting through the light. He thought of a river again, not the Danube this time, but the river of time itself, carrying fathers and sons, carrying cities and empires, carrying even philosophy toward whatever waits beyond sight. He wrote another note, a private whisper. Teach what you can, then let go. And after that, he rested, listening to the fortress settle into night, letting the dark grow soft around him, letting each breath arrive and depart without argument. In Vindobona, time became a narrow hallway. Days were measured by small things, the change of guards, the refilling of lamps, the scrape of a chair as a secretary sat down with new messages, the sound of a distant horn somewhere in the camp, low and tired, not a call to glory, just a signal that life was still moving forward. Marcus woke before sunrise, as he had for decades, but now rising left him trembling. He would sit on the edge of the bed for a long moment, letting his breath find its rhythm, letting his mind settle into the only place he trusted, the present. Outside, the world was still winter gray, even when the calendar said spring. And then came the morning when he knew the boundary was no longer approaching. It was here. He dressed slowly, not in imperial splendor, just a clean tunic, a cloak, and the old ring that had belonged to his grandfather. He asked for his writing materials and the lamp. The flame wavered and steadied. Dust floated through the light like tiny ghosts of snow. He wrote a final meditation, not for history, not for an audience, but for himself. Death is not evil. It is the completion of a cycle. Use the remaining moments well. When he finished, he set the stylus down with careful hands and sat very still, listening. In the silence, he could hear his own heartbeat, steady but weaker, like a drum moving farther away. He could hear the fortress around him, stone holding cold, the way memory holds grief. Word of his condition traveled through the camp faster than any official messenger. Soldiers gathered in the courtyard below his quarters, thousands of them, standing shoulder to shoulder. Their faces were rough with wind and years. Their boots were caked with mud. Some held their helmets in their hands, as if the day had become a kind of vigil. They did not shout. They waited. A strange thing happens when people love a leader. They become quiet. Commodus arrived with a retinue that felt out of place. Silk and perfume moving through a fortress that smelled of smoke and iron. Even the horses in the courtyard seemed to sense the wrongness of it, shifting their weight as if uncomfortable with luxury. Marcus asked for his son. The meeting was private. A small room, a small fire. Two men, father and heir, with the empire hovering between them like a shadow. Marcus spoke with tenderness and with a kind of controlled sorrow. He told Commodus that the throne is not a stage. It is a burden that never sleeps. He reminded him that every decision will echo beyond the walls of a palace, that a careless gesture can become a famine, a riot, a war. That justice is not a word to display. It is a habit, practiced daily, like breath. He spoke of self-mastery, of resisting flattery, of listening to those who disagree, because truth rarely enters a room on soft feet. Commodus listened, and for a moment, there was something almost human in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty. Then it passed. He asked about the ceremony, about the army, about how quickly news could reach Rome, about the practical mechanics of becoming emperor. Marcus answered, because duty demanded answers even when the heart wanted different questions. When Commodus left, Marcus closed his eyes and rested his fingers against his own palm, feeling the pulse there. Some stories do not end with a lesson learned. Some stories end with the lesson offered, and the listener choosing what they will. Later that day, Marcus asked to see his senior commanders. They came quietly, one by one, faces drawn, voices low. Marcus reviewed the frontier situation with the same calm precision he had always used. Even now, he spoke of treaties and supplies, of patrols and watchfulness. He reminded them that the peace they held was fragile, and that discipline, not rage, keeps an empire alive. Then he transferred command formally to Commodus in the presence of those officers, making legitimacy unmistakable, sealing the succession with ritual and law. The soldiers outside lifted their voices in the required acclamations, but the sound carried an edge of reluctance, like a door closing slowly on a bright room. That night, Marcus experienced a brief easing, the strange rally that sometimes visits the dying like a quiet kindness. He used it to write letters, To the Senate, he wrote of the empire's challenges and the need for steady governance. To governors, he wrote practical instructions. To friends, he wrote gratitude. To his surviving children, he wrote with the gentle authority of someone who knew how fragile love is when time is short. He urged them to live with integrity, to remember that status is a costume, to treat people well when no one is watching. He wrote as if each line were a small candle placed along a dark road. Before dawn, he asked for his personal effects. There were not as many as people would imagine. Some books, some letters, a few small objects kept for sentiment rather than value. He gave gifts to servants who had stayed close. He asked that veterans who had served beside him be honored. He approved bonuses because he understood the simplest truth of armies, that loyalty is not only built on ideals, but on bread and pay and the feeling of being seen. When the sky began to pale, Marcus asked to address the troops one last time. His advisors hesitated. The doctors warned him. He insisted. They carried him to a balcony above the courtyard. The cold air touched his face. Below, the soldiers stood like a forest of still bodies. Watching, Marcus looked out at them and felt the weight of years. He spoke softly, but the courtyard held the sound the way stone holds warmth. He thanked them for their endurance, for their discipline, for their courage. He reminded them that they were not merely tools of imperial will, but guardians of people who would never know their names. Farmers and children and merchants sleeping safely because a border held. Then, in a moment that surprised even his closest friends, Marcus apologized. Not theatrically. Simply, he acknowledged the hardships he had imposed. The long winters, the muddy marches, the friends they had buried without ceremony. He told them that he had tried to choose what was necessary, not what was easy. He asked them to hold their duty steady in the years ahead, even when leadership changed, even when the world tempted them toward bitterness. Finally, he commended Commodus to their service. The response rose like thunder against the fortress walls. Loyalty to a dying man wrapped into a final roar. After that, Marcus returned to his room. He asked to be left alone. The lamp was lit again. The flame made the air shimmer. Dust drifted. The room smelled faintly of ink and wool and old smoke. Outside, the fortress settled, the way a body settles into sleep. Marcus lay back and listened to his breathing. Inhale. Exhale. He remembered the Danube, dark and steady. He remembered Rome, marble and noise. He remembered the faces of children he had lost. He remembered Lucius, gone. He remembered the small, quiet moments that had sustained him more than any triumph. A hand held, a fair judgment given, a letter written honestly. He felt no need for grand thoughts now. Only the simplest. This was enough. In the early hours, while the camp still slept and the guards' footsteps were slow and careful, Marcus Aurelius died. Peacefully, so gently that the servants in the next room did not realize he was gone until they came to check the lamp and saw the stillness. Complete and soft, like a candle finally closing its light. The news moved through the fortress like cold wind. Soldiers wept openly. Officers stood in silence. Even hostages held within the walls spoke quietly of the emperor's fairness. For a moment, it felt as if the entire frontier held its breath. Commodus was acclaimed without delay. The transfer proceeded exactly as Marcus had designed it. No sudden violence, no competing claims. The machine of empire continued, smooth on the surface. But something had changed. Something unseen. A certain kind of restraint had left the room. Marcus's body was prepared for the journey back to Rome. Veterans volunteered to escort him, considering it an honor to walk beside the man who had shared their cold and mud. Along the roads, people gathered to watch the procession pass. Some threw flowers. Some stood with bowed heads. Many simply stared, trying to understand how a person could be both emperor and human, and how such a person could still vanish like anyone else. In Rome, the Senate decreed honors. They declared him divine. They spoke of him as the last of the good emperors, the final ruler who had held power like a bowl of water, careful not to spill it into cruelty. Yet in the quiet corners of memory, another truth lingered. Marcus had feared what might come next, and soon that fear began to take shape. Commodus returned to the comforts of the capital. The frontier policies were softened or abandoned. Advisors who spoke of restraint found themselves pushed aside. The court filled with flatterers. The taste for spectacle grew louder. The careful balance between justice and necessity began to wobble. Rome did not fall in a single night. Empires rarely do. They crack slowly. They shrink in small decisions. They lose their spine one indulgence at a time. Still, Marcus's words survived. His private meditations, written in camps and fortresses, found readers. Soldiers copied lines about duty and endurance. Administrators found comfort in his reminders to focus on what can be controlled. Philosophers recognized the rare honesty of a man with absolute power questioning himself in private. Even people who disagreed with his beliefs could feel the warmth of his discipline, the calm of his attention. And perhaps that is the strangest form of immortality. Not statues, not titles, not the applause of crowds, just a voice, quiet and steady, reminding you that you can choose your response, even when the world is chaotic. So, as the fire beside us sinks lower and the candlelight softens, you can let this story settle in the way snow settles on a field, covering the sharp edges, leaving a smooth hush. Marcus did not conquer death. No one does. He only met it without flinching, and in that meeting, he left behind a simple, difficult, soothing invitation. Live with care, let go with grace, and rest when the night finally arrives. If you want, linger with me for a little longer on that road back to Rome. The procession moved at the pace of tired horses, wheels complaining softly on stone, then falling quiet on packed earth. In early mornings, mist rose from fields and made the world look unfinished, as if the landscape itself were holding its breath. Villagers stood near their gates with hands tucked into sleeves, watching the covered bier pass. They did not know Senate arguments or frontier plans. They only knew the feeling of being governed by someone who, at least in rumor, had tried to be fair. At night, guards lit small fires beside the road. Sparks rose and vanished into the dark. Men spoke in murmurs, remembering the emperor's calm, repeating fragments of his notes the way people repeat prayers, not for magic, just for steadiness. And in the days that followed, something less visible than funeral rites began to move. The writings, pages copied by secretaries, lines memorized by officers, small notes passed between friends who did not trust the court's new tone. The meditations were not a polished book, just reminders. A man speaking to himself in the dark, and that rawness made them feel close, as if you were leaning in to hear a private truth. Some read them in barracks, some in quiet rooms above shops, some in villas where lamps burned late. They read them because they were in pain and needed a way to endure, or because they were powerful and needed a way to stay human, or simply because the voice was calm, and calm is rare. And that is another darker truth tucked inside this story. A good ruler can hold decay back for a while, like hands holding water in a bowl. If the next hands are careless, it spills, not all at once, but drop by drop, until one day you look down and realize what has been lost. Still, the voice remains, not the voice of command, but the voice of practice. So let the images blur gently now, like candle smoke curling into shadow. The fortress walls, the river breath, the dust in lamplight, the slow road home, all of it settling into quiet inside you. Take one slow breath with me. In and out. Feel the weight of the day loosen. Let the mind drift the way the river drifts, carrying nothing that must be held. If a thought arrives, notice it, then let it pass, like a hoofprint filling with water and smoothing itself back into the earth. The fire can keep watch for you now. You do not have to. Good night.